Georgie's really passionate about mental health and in particular burnout. What I found really interesting about this conversation is the interplay between the very human emotional elements of burnout and how they affect corporate culture as a whole. See if you can learn something. I know I certainly did. Hello, welcome back to What a Future. We're joined today by Georgi Natchev. Now, Georgi's a really interesting guy. Started off in life more in the sort of business and finance world, the sort of hardcore business elements. But through a few sort of consulting roles and a few roles, he really understood that the bit that matters to him more is mental health and particularly preventing burnout. So since then, along with a few other guys, he started a really interesting startup called Digiburn. These guys are taking the world by storm when it comes to preventing burnout in the workplace. I'm so grateful to have you with us today, Georgie. But let's go straight into it now. What is, and we can probably already guess the answer given the intro, but what is the biggest problem affecting the world of work right now?
Yeah, the no-brainer is burnout, amongst other things. We are living amidst the global mental health crisis, but joke aside, burnout rates have been exploding, and it's a serious topic.
Excellent. So what does that mean with regards to, most people here, we probably experience burnout or some level of it, but what does that mean on a sort of macro scale? Where does that leave us?
Sure. As we recently discussed with another guest who actually described it as macros and micros in life. So burnout can have multiple phases and can occur due to multiple reasons, but ultimately it's, or at least that's our understanding nonetheless, losing touch with the inner self, losing touch with yourself, which then leads to a variety of different consequences depending on the specific case.
And can you give examples of that? Where does that sort of push us?
Sure. So the most important point probably is finally grasping the concept of burnout being a process. So this is actually also what makes it quite dangerous, because we tend to go through the different stages without realizing, firstly, and secondly, at every stage there is a caveat. So there is something that's undermining, disrupting our physical and mental well-being. However, just as a hidden devil's circle or self-fulfilling prophecy, at every next stage we try harder and harder or invest ourselves more and more into those same toxic habits that we have started building at the very beginning. So probably the most critical or slippery path of the burnout journey is the very first moment, which oftentimes is called the honeymoon or the moment of excitement, when everything seems to be going super easy, everything is rosy, maybe we have a new project, maybe you have a new job, or some other externality provoked this change of state, and we see an increase in our productivity. And here we already plant the seed for some of the toxic things that we're going to do later on in the next stages. Namely, okay, it is fine for me to start reducing my self-care or start, sacrificing a little bit of here and a little bit of there. And thereby I actually create this kind of a underconscious or not really realized connection between my increased output and the sacrifices that I am doing. So in the next stages, regardless how many pieces has the pie, because there are different theories from 3 to 6 to 8, 10, 12, doesn't really matter. The main point is observing it as a process, because it helps then identify the various common indicators per stage, which again gives us the empowerment and opportunity to actually make the U-turn and change the direction of the vehicle. So at the very beginning, we plant the seed for certain aspects, like say self-negligence, And then in the process, in the next stages of burnout, typically the output continuously decreases. So does our physical and mental capacity or resourcefulness. However, due to us having already established that devious link between self-sacrifice and output, we actually keep on digging our own grave with ever more fury, because we want to get back into that excitement and honeymoon stage, because it really, really felt good. And this, again, further deteriorates our mental and physical well-being, and also, supports the entire notion for the big bang at the very end, the big meltdown that otherwise could be avoided.
That's really interesting. I've never thought about that idea that, you start a new project, you start a new idea. I'm a classic starter, not a finisher. Like, I just get really excited by something. I'm gonna crack on and do this thing. And actually that is, you're right, that's the beginning. Every time that I felt that kind of overwhelmingness, I understand looking back, like, that was it. That was the thing. It was the new job. It was the new project. It was the new whatever. I think that's really, really, really powerful. I think so. Okay, this is happening on the kind of individual level. That's the sort of process that we're going through. What's the effect on our, both on our lives, but also on our sort of corporate lives and the lives of the companies? I'm curious to sort of get the link there.
Absolutely. And maybe just a small detour here. Whilst burnout is most perceived and studied in its professional context, it can occur in multiple other areas as well. So you mentioned new work, new job, new project, new team, so on. Great. But it could also happen for, let's say, students. It could happen with your love life. It could happen with parenting. So there are so many different areas, basically. And the process is more or less the same, or the typical indicators, determinants are more or less the same. It's just different feelings. So the glass is still the same. It's just the type of water we are filling it is different until it overflows. But then back to your question, how it... sorry for going away. How does it reflect?
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And once you get passionate, it's quite easy to lose track. There are so many different things that we can actually debate on, especially in mental health and burnout specifically. Yeah, it's so colorful, it's so holistic and so fuzzy at the same time. And that's probably one of the reasons why it hasn't really been solved yet, right? Because perhaps you do have some providers on the prevention side or maybe in the assessment side and so on, but generally, and this I think holds true also for mental health, we are still kind of relying mostly on subjective assessments and subjective measures without really having found a meaningful way to onboard the ocean of data that we are living in, and then creating the so-called digital phenotyping and building the future of mental health by embodying in situation and in time, in context prompts, in context measures, in context actions, and so on. But let's get back to your question. We can get carried away otherwise. I guess the first, in terms of the personal impact, there are a couple of fuses that typically go out first. So, for example, quite typical, my sleep quality reduces, my nutrition has an impact. Quite often, I may reduce the time I spent in sport and other recreational activities, which seems a no-brainer for short-term solution. And for short-term, it's fine, but thing is, life is a marathon. It's not a short sprint. And these are the things that I sacrifice. So my body starts to change in a way. First, I get a little bit more, tiredness. My mind gets a little bit more cloudy. Then I need usually to help myself to externalities, like, for example, increase stimulatives, let's say caffeine, and maybe also increase, sometimes, not always, but maybe also increase sedatives, like, for example, alcohol at the end of the day in order to bring me down again. And we can speak a lot on the personal side, but all of this also has implications, as you mentioned, on your environment and also on the corporate side of things. So in terms of my personal sphere, typically I close myself for a while. I start prioritizing more my work. Speaking of the professional context, maybe I spend less time with my friends. I may become a little bit more snappy. I may become less tolerant. And one thing that's also quite typical is becoming less capable of going in depth or going into detail. So we've been speaking with burnout triumphants, we call them, from all around the world. And just recently, one of the triumphants said something very similar, going a little like this. I had this new project, this new responsibility. Suddenly and very, very unexpectedly, I was being promoted almost to the top of the organization, and it was completely out of my league. And it was going for a couple of months, and I felt that something not quite right, but I wasn't able to put my finger on it. And then whilst I was speaking with a friend of mine who was visiting in a different country, that same friend told me, hey, you are not able to hold the conversation as you would otherwise do. Whatever I ask you, you stay only on the superficial and on the ground level, but you're absolutely scared and running away every time I try to get you in any kind of a deeper conversation or get into more details on any kind of a topic. So this would have been, for example, an example not from us, but actually from a triumphant, from somebody that went through burning out himself. The lack of capacity to make deeper connections, to go into more cognitive intense tasks, even when it's actually considering something as simple as having a dinner chat with a good friend of yours. So having this interpolated, or maybe if we speculate a little, let's put it into a different context. If I'm not able to speak with, because in this specific case, it was actually a good friendship, a close friendship. It was somebody who that specific person was able to trust well with basically everything, and that's why also the blunt feedback he received. But let's interpolate it or extrapolate it. If I'm not able to actually speak on ice level and into depth with my closest people, am I really still capable of doing that same thing with myself? Because typically the externalities are good indicators of our internal world. As we like to say, the external world is just a reflection of the internal one. So a lot of these kind of small hints and triggers and bits and pieces around are an indicator how well, or in this specific case, how badly that specific person was doing with himself. So he knew that he's completely overwhelmed, but himself wasn't at this point of in the physical or mental state to actually have a deeper look into what's going on. Maybe step back a little, maybe have a minute to think, maybe have a minute to digest all the changes that are going. And again, this comes back to something we discussed before we started our interview right now, being in this survival mode, being in fight or flight. And this is one of probably the biggest reasons or strongest contributors towards people burning out or also drifting away into other mental health states. So typically our body has two main states, and it's either fight or flight, or rest and digest, or rest and grow, and so on. And as soon as we see that white-toothed tiger back then, but nowadays maybe it's something else, maybe it's an angry client, maybe it's our boss, maybe it's otherwise an external event that's provoking a strong internal emotional reaction, then our body immediately goes into fight or flight. And being into fight or flight means that the body prepares basically exactly for this, either to fight, so be able to endure, or again flee, but it again needs endurance. That means that all the energy that otherwise would, or all the resources that otherwise would go to the brain, to the stomach for digestion, to our immune system and so on, they are redirected for these small moments. I know you're playing games, I used to be playing games as well. So back in the days we had Need for Speed, a car racing simulator where you have this kind of a neutral button, and when you step on the neutral, or when you kick down the turbo, then you have a boost, but it's short-lived. It's for short term. You cannot go on and on this same. And if we put it into another example, when you're going on the highway, your turbo isn't constantly on. You cannot really, step to the floor the gas and expect that nothing's going to happen and the car is going to endure for infinite amount of time. And the same happens here. So as soon as the body goes into this fight or flight, everything is focused only around the survival. And when we are in this survival mode, firstly, it's quite deteriorated. It, for the short term, is fine because it can be this kind of a needed boost to overcome something. However, more often than not, we don't realize that the modern times where we're living, the new normal, the always connectedness, the constant availability, also receiving our or reading emails and other prompts also late in the evening and so on, leads without us noticing into the fact that we live most of our daily life actually in fight or flight mode, which I cannot really stress it enough how bad it is actually, and it puts us into survival mode. Once we are in the survival mode, we become egoistic, we become selfish, because that's the time. It's not the time to rest and create. It's not the time to think about better ways to build society. It's not the time to think about work process improvements. It's not the time to think whether that colleague of mine, for example, or that friend of mine at the moment has any other human needs different than the current topic of discussion. So obviously this limits vastly our capability of being human to the ones that we are closest to. So our internal or closest circle absolutely takes a hit and suffers. And then the same continues towards the office. And then in the office, it's actually even a little bit worse, I would assume, because in the office, we wear our mask and we are in a specific role. We have even higher expectations, or we set ourselves to higher expectations. What do I communicate? Do I show vulnerability? How do I stand into the space? What do others think of me? What do I think of them? And so on. So this kind of a work mode increasingly reinforces the notion of us not necessarily being sincere with our own self, but also with others. And the more we progress in this kind of a burnt out state, the less empathic we are, the more snappy we are, the more toxic we become for everybody around us. So it could be the colleagues, it could be my direct line of command, it could be my subordinates, it could be the clients. And one thing that we have been discussing with you, and it's amazing what Water has done for it, is your calculator for the impact of mental health issues within the teams, and I find it absolutely intriguing, and it's such a good thing that you have done this, because so much of the process actually falls into hidden cost, because the visible cost is easy to track. The burnt out person maybe goes into a sick leave. Maybe there is one or two clients lost. Maybe there is a short-term continuity risk because of key knowledge expertise not being there, or anything like that. However, there are also a lot of hidden costs because, for example, your calculator focuses around the retention, the finding of the new person, onboarding, and so on. But there is also kind of a perspective in the history that we should probably also have a look at. So the process of burnout, it could be very short, but typically it's longer. Throughout this entire process, the person becomes increasingly toxic. And due to that toxicity, we don't really know, and it's almost impossible to measure how many other colleagues or people were maybe offended, insulted, maybe deprioritized, or made otherwise to suffer. How many lost opportunities in terms of sales and business development are there? How many other kind of non-observed things have been ongoing throughout the entire process? And that's why it's so crucial to really understand burnout is a process. And the better we understand the stages, really doesn't matter how many are there, but the better we understand the stages and the indicators, the better the chances that we as individuals can take some measures, but also we as colleagues, or we as leadership, or we as managers, or maybe we as owners, or maybe C-level, or even board level. Because at the end of the day, probably the biggest or the worst thing, our understanding anyway, at the moment for the corporate structure is all levels passing burnout and mental health a little bit like a hot potato, because every level has different set of challenges that in the last couple of years, so let's say starting Corona and onwards, have put them into a little bit or a little bit more into this survival mode and fight or flight. So a lot of different key positions are slightly closed, slightly more focused on the personal perspective, and slightly less capable of actually considering the bigger picture and working for the higher purpose or for the entire organization. And so things are being discussed. Some quick measures or quick fixes are being introduced here and there. Maybe it's a meditation app, maybe it's a little bit of a benefit, maybe on Fridays we work 2 hours less. All of that is nice, it's completely great, and it is helpful. I'm not neglecting it's not helpful, I'm not saying that for sure, but what I am saying is that burnout is complex, it's very heterogeneous. So it depends on the industry, it depends on the level of hierarchy, it depends on the specific responsibility. Just as an example, to make it more understandable, people with higher social exposure are actually at higher risk, meaning, for example, HR responsible or managing roles and so on, or salespeople are the ones that firstly are most exposed. So being toxic has the biggest negative impact on everybody around, but then the probability of them suffering is the biggest, and probably also the measures are different. So there are so many different things that need to be put into perspective and into context in order to really be helpful, and in order to really create this kind of self-nurturing or self-caring environment. And what's also quite noteworthy probably here in the discussion would be the personal empowerment, entitlement, and taking on responsibility, taking control. So why I said passing the hot potato, because then it's quite easy to, point at the next level or the next department in the organization, say, yeah, do something about it. And it's very easy to do something about it, and probably a plethora of tools that are being introduced. The tools per se are completely fine, and they could have a good result and a good impact. However, if we lack the leadership, if we lack leading by example, if we lack the internal champions that not only recognize the tool, not only resonate with the need for action and the added value, but also show in pure practical terms how it works and what exactly have these kind of single individuals or separate leadership roles have done for themselves and also for the teams, and also showing vulnerability, because at the end of the day we are living in times where showing of weakness is sometimes being run away as if it's complete evil. But at the end of the day we're all just humans, right? And it's not easy to be human nowadays. So maybe paradoxical or not, but I catch myself quite often speaking about rehumanizing humans or rehumanizing the human in the workplace in order to really be able to cater better to the personal needs, to learn self-acceptance, to learn self-love, self-care, so that once I have mastered all of these for my own sake and towards myself, I can act according these same principles towards everybody else as well. So one last probably metaphor, and happy to kind of go into more conversational mode here. When the plane loses pressure, you hear put on your oxygen mask first and then cater to others. And here it's exactly the same. At the time being, at the moment, it seems that the plane is already not only losing pressure, it has lost almost all the pressure, and still the people responsible, instead of really firstly putting the mask on themselves in order to have the better resourcefulness and also show others and lead by example, they seem to just be showing the mask to everybody else. Yeah, there's the mask, just put it. But it doesn't work this way, and the plane is yet to crash. So it's a great moment. I believe we're living in the best time in humanity ever. It's such a blessing of having people and companies like you catering for a better understanding of the corporate environment and of the risks and improving it. And I utterly believe that we need even more, because the need is there, and none of us can really make this impact that's needed on a big enough scale, first. And second, as mentioned, there's so many different people, so many different organizations, so many different cases, and more often than not, or more likely than not, each one of them might need a slightly different angle to really reach a profound, meaningful, long-term lasting change for the better environment, better society, better planet of 2050 or 2100 and onward.
That's excellent, and grateful for your kind words towards me there. I mean, I think ultimately, I see you as being on the front line here, really. Not me. My job here, and really what I've come to understand, and I think is sort of very much in line with what you're saying there, is that anything you look at is probably more complex than it initially seems. And actually, if we want to really solve these problems, then we have to accept and understand that complexity. And that makes our job harder when it comes to fixing it, but it makes the solution so much more effective when we do. And I think that's a really sort of powerful message, really, for the sort of whole industry, I think. But I mean, your sort of analogies there were very good, and the sort of pictures that you painted of really what the effect of burnout is. And you rightfully led us through kind of like, here's an individual level, and then here's an interpersonal level, and here's a corporate level, and it's like, holy, it just gets more scary as it goes on, right? Like the effect is insane. Look, do you have any idea yourself, your research, your inklings, whatever, what percentage of people approximately within the workplace would you class as being burnt out?
Yeah, absolutely. So that,
or at least the scale, on the processes.
Yeah, I think that's slightly above our payroll level and qualification. However, luckily there are a bunch of friendly organizations out there that are studying exactly these kind of areas. So numerous of studies starting 2020 and onwards by renowned names, known names like McKinsey, Gallup, Statista, and a bunch of others as well, have been studying what's going on in the workplace. And for example, for last year, some statistics were suggesting around roughly 50% endangerment rate across Europe, with some slight variances. So it was, I guess, 38 to 55 or something, but on average around 50%. People in working age across Europe being endangered of burnout. And then this was further reinforced because, for example, McKinsey is quite keen on the topic. I think they have a dedicated department only for burnout. And then they came out with a subsequent paper claiming that around 30% of the European working force is actually at burnout, not endangered, but experiencing burnout symptomatics already. So I'm nobody here to judge whether the numbers are right and what are the figures, but one thing is right. Multiple different sources covering both Europe and as well the US, because ultimately the dynamics are quite similar. Yeah, the culture is different, the people, a lot of things are different, but the dynamic or the overall trend is similar. So if we say these are independent resources, also trustworthy such, as mentioned, also Statista, Gallup, and so on, then it's quite sure to say that there is something going on. And it's definitely way above 25-30% of endangerment. That's for sure. Which makes it super scary.
Yeah, I mean, that's insane, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an insane figure. I mean, if you think of, an organization, let's say a sort of random organization, say it's got 500 staff in it, that means approximately kind of 200 of them, 180 of them are experiencing burnout, and a further approximately 70 of them are at risk. I mean, that's an awful lot of people. And it's also, from a company's perspective, an awful lot of resource. A company is nothing without its people. A company is simply a product of what its people can achieve. And so if you're sort of losing that many down to what you were describing, apathy, toxic interpersonal relations, not looking after self-care. This is a sort of spiral that just gets worse and worse unless it's intervened in. Surely it's not a great sort of mental leap to understand that that's having a serious effect on what we can achieve within organisations in the world, and I mean that's incredible. Look, I'm keen to move on to the second part of it. I think we've kind of doom and gloomed enough for a minute there. What I'd like to say is, let's wave a magic wand, right? Digiburn comes along and fixes all of the problems, and we're still susceptible to burnout, right? We're human. Like this is a thing. It's not going to change. We're not going to suddenly stop being human. We're not going to turn into robots, as we were talking about Shona, previously. But we can, let's say we can fix this problem. Like, what does that world look like? That world where we're ahead of burnout, where we spot the process, where we move. 5 years time, what's happened?
Yeah, I wouldn't obsess necessarily with burnout. Let's speak of mental health as a whole. In an ideal world, burnout should be already just in the history books, because ultimately, as everything or as many other conditions, it is avoidable. It can be prevented. So in an ideal world, I imagine that either through technology or also through our internal system and internal compass, we understand the importance of mental health and of self-care in a way that we work for it proactively. So again, regardless what is the path leading us there, because probably it is going to be technology infused, at least to a part. The ultimate outcome, what counts, is really investing the effort. Like when you say, "Oh, I want to have a beach body." Well, if you want to have a beach body in July, you start working out probably latest January, just after Christmas time. And mental health is exactly the same. So if I would have a magic wand, and by no means I would imply that Digiburn itself would be a sufficient magic wand. On the contrary, we welcome and are super happy when we see that more and more value-driven companies, value-driven providers are in the field, because there is so much to do. So let's say we all unite in a big magic wand, maybe multiple of us, and we wave it, then the ideal outcome I would describe in three parallels. Firstly, on the individual side of things, I would love to see individuals that are connected with the inner self well enough to understand the importance of self-care and also have the needed level of self-talk, let's say, or self-feeling, to know when to rest, to know when to recover, to know when they need to change the direction or make a slight adaptation. Then on the second level would be us as a society. It would be great if we can be better humans. It would be great if all of us could show that same acceptance and humility towards others and kindness, because everybody tends to run into a bad day or two, and the more we understand this, the easier it is to actually break the negative circle. Let's say somebody cuts you in the juncture. You don't need to become angry. There are ways to handle and actually stop it right there, because otherwise, if I also become angry, then it's already a little bit of a domino effect. So I would wish us as a society to be able to really understand, see when are the toxic trends, especially also in mental health, have the kindness towards others, and cut it loose at the time of a very beginning, before it has become a snowball effect. And thirdly, then for organizations, I would really desire to have better understanding of the differences in people, better understanding of, and I think it's a holistic, probably lengthy process. It probably starts already at the recruitment level, and actually even before the recruitment, have your company or organizational values in place. First, know what exactly do you stand for, apart from profits, obviously. And then start from the recruitment, find a way to really fill the gaps or fill your meaningful positions, and I mean all positions are meaningful. Fill these spots with the right people have the right cultural and value-driven fit, and then find a good way to create self-sustaining and self-nurturing environments where people can really not only work but love and live together. Of course, it's more on the net output focus is usually in corporational environment. I understand this, but still, the better you understand the needs of the company, the better you understand your values, the better you understand why are you here as a corporation. Why exactly are you in life? Why exactly do you help, or do you help at all others? The better you can understand which specific people and in what constellations within that organization can be put together in order to create this perpetual, or let's say, organizations of momentum, humanized organizations driven in a human-centric manner where people matter and are given the opportunity to really fully fledge themselves, show the best they have, evolve into the entire palette of colors and quirkiness that each one of us carries for the best interest of the individual, of the team, and of the organization.
That's fantastic, Georgi. That's what a vision of the world. If we can get to that, I think that's really powerful. Look, what a way to finish with that statement at the end there, Georgi. Look, I'm so grateful for you coming on today. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you.
It's all our pleasure. Thank you, Fraser. Looking forward to the next one, and the best of luck with the series.
Brilliant. Thank you. Cheers, Georgi.